On my birthday, my parents invited nearly 100 relatives to a formal family dinner. I thought it was reconciliation. I thought it was effort. I was wrong. When everyone was seated and the room finally went quiet, my parents stood up not to toast me, not to celebrate, but to announce that I was no longer part of the family. No shouting. No argument. Just a calm, public decision to erase me. What they didn't realize was this: cutting me off didn't destroy my life. It exposed theirs. Because the moment I stopped begging, everything changed. My name is Liora Bennett, and the invitation arrived 3 weeks before my birthday, thick ivory cardstock. My parents' last name embossed in understated silver. My full name centered with ceremonial precision. It wasn't affectionate, it wasn't personal, but it was deliberate. It read simply: Family Dinner. No smiley face. No celebration language. Still, the timing made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. My parents, Edmund and Clarice Bennett, and I had mastered a version of civility that required no honesty. We spoke only when necessary. Updates, logistics, obligations, nothing that risked discomfort. But birthdays had always existed in a strange exception one night where the family pretended closeness without asking questions. I told myself this dinner might be different. That maybe this was an olive branch. A chance to reset what had been quietly broken for so long. I imagined a toast. A restrained acknowledgement. Something that said, "You still count." The guest list was extensive, nearly 100 relatives. That should have unsettled me. Instead, I interpreted it as effort. As intention. Hope is quiet like that. It doesn't shout warnings. It whispers reassurance. I bought a modest dress. I practiced calm answers. I went to bed believing this invitation meant I still belonged. The dinner was held at my parents' house on the hill, the one everyone still called the family home even though it had never felt like mine. By the time I arrived, the driveway was already lined with unfamiliar cars, and the sound of voices carried through the open garden doors, loud, polished, confident. Inside, long tables had been arranged in careful symmetry, white linen pressed to perfection. Crystal glasses caught the light. Nearly 100 relatives filled the space, aunts I barely knew, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, people who shared my last name but not my life. Everywhere I looked, conversations paused just long enough to register my presence before smoothly resuming. No one said happy birthday. There was no banner. No cake in sight. Instead, servers moved silently between tables, refilling wine glasses as if this were a formal reception rather than a celebration. My mother, Clarice Bennett, greeted guests with practiced warmth, her smile precise and untouchable. My father, Edmund, stood near the head of the room, shaking hands, nodding, performing authority. I searched for my place and found it at the far end of the table, technically included, strategically distant. As I sat down, a strange awareness settled over me. This wasn't a dinner arranged for me. It was a dinner arranged around me. The room hummed with expectation, the kind that comes before an announcement. I felt it in the way conversations lowered when my parents moved. In the way eyes flicked toward the center of the room. Whatever this night was about, it wasn't my birthday. The room didn't quiet all at once. It happened in stages, first the clink of cutlery fading, then the soft collapse of side conversations, until the only sound left was the low hum of the lights overhead. I looked up just as my father rose from his chair at the head of the table. For a brief, foolish second, I expected a toast. He cleared his throat, resting one hand on the back of his chair, the other holding his wineglass not raised, just anchored. My mother stood beside him, her posture immaculate, her expression unreadable. Together, they looked rehearsed. This evening, my father began, his voice calm and measured, is not about celebration. A few people shifted in their seats. No one interrupted. He spoke about family values, about legacy, about the importance of alignment and contribution. Each word landed with careful precision, like it had been tested in advance. My name hadn't been mentioned yet, but I felt every sentence tightening around me. Then he said it. For that reason, Clarice and I have made a decision regarding our daughter, Liora. My mother took over seamlessly, her tone cool and procedural. She explained that I no longer represented the direction of the family. That continuing to acknowledge me publicly would be misleading. That Effective immediately, I would no longer be recognized as part of the Bennett family. There was no anger in her voice. No apology. Just finality. No one protested. No one asked what I had done. The silence pressed in from all sides as my parents stood there, not as people delivering news, but as administrators closing a file. I sat perfectly still, realizing this wasn't an outburst. It was an announcement. Once the decision was spoken, the explanation followed as if erasing me required footnotes. My father didn't look at me when he continued. He addressed the room instead, as though presenting a quarterly report. I had chosen a career that didn't align with the family's long-term interests. I valued privacy over visibility, independence over collaboration. Each trait was framed not as a difference but as a deficiency. My mother stepped in smoothly, expanding on his points. I had declined to attend certain events. I hadn't leveraged the family name. I hadn't made myself useful in the ways they expected. "We've given Liora every opportunity," she said gently. "But opportunity only matters if it's recognized." They spoke about effort. About investment. About return. Then came the comparisons, subtle, but deliberate. A cousin praised for loyalty. A sibling mentioned for commitment. I was positioned between them like a cautionary example, the outcome of choosing the wrong priorities. No one asked for my side. There was no pause for clarification, no invitation to respond. The reasons weren't meant to be debated. They were meant to be recorded. As they spoke, something strange happened. The humiliation dulled, replaced by clarity. I recognized the language instantly, not parental concern, but corporate justification. The same vocabulary used when a brand cuts ties with something no longer profitable. This wasn't about behavior. Or respect. Or love. It was about optics. They weren't erasing me because I had failed them. They were erasing me because I didn't perform the role they had written. And in a family where belonging was conditional, deviation was treated as liability. By the time my parents finished, the verdict felt airtight. Not because it was true, but because it had been rehearsed. After my parents finished speaking, no one moved. Nearly 100 people sat around me, people who had known me since childhood, who had attended my graduations, who had hugged me at weddings and funerals. And yet, in that moment, the room felt emptier than it ever had. A few eyes met mine briefly, then slid away. Some stared down at their plates as if something urgent had appeared there. Others reached for their glasses, sipping slowly, carefully, like this was an intermission they needed to endure. No one asked a question. No one said my name. I waited, not because I expected rescue, but because silence like that feels temporary at first, like someone will eventually clear their throat, laugh nervously, break the tension. But nothing came. I realized then that this wasn't neutrality. It was consent. They weren't shocked. They weren't confused. They were relieved it wasn't them. Speaking up would have meant risk, discomfort, disfavor, perhaps even replacement. Remaining quiet cost them nothing. The weight of that understanding settled heavily in my chest. It wasn't just my parents who were cutting me off. It was the collective decision of the room to let it happen. In that stillness, I saw how power actually worked in this family. It didn't shout. It didn't argue. It waited to see who would comply. And everyone did. I sat there, surrounded by relatives who shared my blood but not my courage, and understood something painfully simple. I wasn't being abandoned. I was being watched disappear. For a long moment, I did nothing. I felt every expectation in the room pressing toward me, waiting for the version of me they recognized, the one who explained, who softened, who tried to fix things before they broke completely. That was the role they were used to, the one that made their decision feel justified. But I didn't give it to them. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list my accomplishments or defend my choices. I didn't ask what I could do to make things right. Instead, I breathed. The realization came quietly, but it was absolute. Begging would not change the outcome. It would only confirm their narrative that my place in this family was something I had to earn back through compliance. I pushed my chair back and stood, the sound cutting cleanly through the silence. Heads turned. My mother's expression tightened, just slightly, as if this wasn't the response she had planned for. I understand, I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. There was no speech after that. No dramatic exit. I picked up my coat, smoothed the fabric once, and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. No one followed. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, and something shifted inside me. The fear I had carried into that room didn't come with me. I realized then that refusing to beg wasn't weakness. It was the first decision I had made that night that truly belonged to me. As I walked away from the house, I knew exactly what my parents believed they had taken from me. They thought I would lose my safety. The unspoken promise that if everything else failed, I could still fall back into the family structure they controlled. They thought I would lose access, connections, introductions, the quiet doors that opened simply because of our last name. They thought I would lose status. That without their recognition, I would shrink in the eyes of everyone who mattered. That being publicly cut off would follow me like a stain, making me smaller wherever I went. Most of all, they thought I would lose my nerve. They expected panic, regret. A late-night phone call filled with apologies and bargaining. They believed I would wake up the next morning overwhelmed by the consequences, desperate to undo what had happened. What they never considered was that I had already learned how to live without them. I paid my own rent. I built my own career. I made choices without asking permission long before they announced their verdict. Their approval had not been supporting me, it had been hovering, conditional, always ready to be withdrawn. The irony was sharp and almost bitter. By disowning me, they hadn't stripped me of stability. They had simply removed the last illusion that I needed them to survive. And once that illusion was gone, there was very little left for them to threaten. I didn't call the next day. I didn't send a message explaining myself or asking what came next. I didn't tell anyone how shocked or hurt I was. I went back to my life exactly as it was before that dinner, only lighter. That was when the silence started to work against them. At first, it was small things. A missed call from my mother that went unanswered. A carefully worded text from my father that pretended the night had been misunderstood. Then another. And another, each one more urgent than the last. They weren't checking on me. They were checking whether they still had access. When days passed without a response, the tone shifted. Concern gave way to irritation. Irritation edged into accusation. They reminded me of everything they had given me, everything I was supposedly risking by staying quiet. But silence doesn't argue. It doesn't defend itself. It just exists. And in that quiet space, their control had nothing to attach to. There was no reaction to manage, no emotion to exploit, no apology to extract. For the first time, I wasn't participating in the cycle. I realized something then: disowning only works if the person being cast out keeps reaching back. The moment I stopped engaging, the decision lost its teeth. They had expected noise. What they got instead was absence. It took longer for the rest of the family to react. At first, there was nothing: no calls, no messages, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. But silence like that can't hold forever. Questions began to surface quietly, passed from one relative to another, gaining weight as they moved. Why hadn't I come back? Why wasn't I asking to be included again? A cousin reached out under the pretense of concern. An aunt sent a vague message about misunderstandings and keeping the family together. None of them apologized. None of them admitted what they had witnessed. They were testing the ground, trying to see if the old dynamics still applied. They didn't. Without my reaction, my parents' announcement began to look less like authority and more like excess. People started noticing the absence they hadn't expected to matter. Events went on without me, but the story felt incomplete, the narrative unresolved. Disowning is meant to be a conclusion. A clean ending. But endings require agreement. As weeks passed, it became clear that cutting me off hadn't restored order. It had exposed how fragile that order was. My parents had drawn a line, assuming everyone would stand neatly behind it. Instead, the line just sat there, unanswered. And in that space, their power thinned. Not because I fought it, but because I refused to acknowledge it as final. The moment I stopped needing their decision to define me, it stopped defining anything at all. I didn't mark that birthday with candles or a wish. There was no dinner to remember it by, no photographs worth keeping. And yet, it became the clearest turning point of my life. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Without the constant pull of my family's expectations, my days felt quieter but not emptier. I made choices without anticipating disapproval. I spoke without editing myself in advance. For the first time, my life wasn't organized around avoiding conflict with people who had already decided who I was allowed to be. I understood then that being disowned hadn't taken anything essential from me. It had simply made visible what had always been true. My place in that family was conditional, and those conditions were never going to change. What changed was me. I stopped framing the night as a loss. It wasn't the moment I was rejected, it was the moment I was released. The power I thought they held over me only existed as long as I kept reaching for their approval. Once I let that go, the fear dissolved with it. That birthday didn't end my family ties. It ended the version of myself that believed love had to be earned through compliance. I didn't walk away with revenge or closure handed to me by someone else. I walked away with ownership of my time, my choices, my future. They thought they were erasing me. Instead, they gave me my life back. If you stayed with me until the end, I want to speak to you directly, not as a story but as a person who lived it. If you've ever been made to feel replaceable, conditional, or small by the people who were supposed to love you first, please know this. You are not broken for wanting dignity. You are not ungrateful for choosing peace. And you are not wrong for walking away from a table where respect was never being served. What I learned is simple but hard-earned: silence can be a boundary. Independence is not betrayal, and love that must be performed is not love at all. You don't owe anyone access to your life just because they share your blood. You owe yourself honesty, safety, and the right to grow without permission. If my story resonated with you, I invite you to leave a comment below. Tell me what part hit closest to home, or share your own experience. Your words might be the thing someone else needs to read tonight to feel less alone. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about boundaries, clarity, and reclaiming your life, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and engaging. It helps these stories reach people who are still standing at that table, wondering if they're allowed to leave.